Hi, so this is part 2 of the video on how to create frequency tables on quantitative data. But this part will deal with how to use technology to do that, specifically how to use StatCrunch. All right, so to get started, I have a homework question pulled up. It doesn't have to be a homework question, but why not? And it's the same one we did in the first part. So because this is a homework question, we can just use this option here to put this data set into StatCrunch. So our data is now in StatCrunch. Just to show you something from the first part, in the first part, I had the data set sorted so we can analyze it. And if you wanted to do that, you don't have to, but if you wanted to do that, if you click on the column header, it'll pull up all these options, and one of them is to sort ascending. And now we can clearly see that the lowest number in our data set is 40 and the largest is 541. If you didn't want to sort the data, you could also get that information by going to the Stat menu, Summary Stats, Columns, because our data set isn't a column, click on our variable, click on Compute, and it gives us a bunch of things that we don't need yet, but it also tells us the minimum and the maximum. So the minimum is 40, the maximum is 541. All right. So how do we create a table? Well, in StatCrunch, everything you need to do for the most part, almost always, is either in the Stat menu or the Graph menu. We're not creating a graph, so graphs are things like box plots and histograms and pie charts and bar graphs and things like that. We're not doing anything like that. We're just creating a table. So because of that, we're going to be in the Stat menu, and there is an option for tables. So that's what we want. So just mouse over Table and then select the frequency option, because that's the kind of table we're creating. You're going to select your variable. So select variable 1, var1. And then by default, you can see that frequency and relative frequency are highlighted. We also want to highlight cumulative frequency, and we can do that by holding down Control and then clicking. So you can click multiple things by just holding down Control. If you just click by itself, it'll unselect everything else. All right, so I'm selecting frequency, relative frequency, and cumulative frequency. All right, we can leave the defaults, and it will give us a lovely frequency table. Actually, it won't give us a lovely frequency table. It'll tell us the frequency of every particular number, so let's not do that. All right, we want to make sure it's binned, it's grouped. So click Compute, and it will create some groups for us, but these aren't the groups we wanted. It's forcing the minimum of the data set to be 0, which isn't right. It's going all the way up to 600. This just doesn't really make sense. Let's have it create the table that we want. So to do that, we're going to group the values, which is called binning in most statistical softwares. So we're going to bin them. We want to start at the lowest number being 40. And remember our class width from before, we want to set the class width to 84. Quick warning here is they're assuming that you're using the class boundary technique, not the class limit technique. So when it shows your limits, it's going to go all the way up to the next number, which is not quite right. You'll see what I mean in a moment. All right, so here we go. So we can see our first class starts at 40, and the next one's 124, next one's 208, next one's 292, 376, 460, and I believe those are the same numbers as before. Let me double check. Yes, those are the same numbers as before. Now, the upper boundaries, these upper limits aren't really quite right. So this first group should end at 123, the next group at 207, 291, etc. Just subtract 1 from these and it will work out perfectly. All right, it does not do class boundaries unless you tell it to. So we could tell it to do class boundaries instead. So I'm just clicking on the edit options. And instead of starting at 40, I can tell it to start at 39.5. And then those are the class boundaries we calculated before. And now it's being done correctly. All right. Now the frequencies, relative frequencies, and cumulative frequencies, it did perfectly. There's no issues here. So our first group has 9 items, next group is 3, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 2. Relative frequencies are what we calculated. Cumulative frequencies are what we calculated. So this is just a little bit of a shortcut, so you don't have to do this by hand. All right, so I hope that all made sense. Again, just be a little bit careful with, how you do the class limits. and boundaries and midpoints. The software doesn't really do those quite right, or not, it doesn't do it wrong, it just doesn't do it the more traditional way. So be careful with that. Other than that, should be pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, let me know.